Coming up, ancestral homelands are important to Indigenous people. ICT is bringing you stories about historical and sacred places, plus stories of identity from Native youth. Join us.
Arizona State University welcomes 3,500 Indigenous students from Arizona and across the nation. It serves one of the largest populations of Indigenous students among U.S. colleges and universities. We created a sense of place for tribal nations to create futures of their own making through community outreach and research, taught by world-class Indigenous faculty where they see a reflection of themselves and their experiences. Find community at ASU.
This is Indian Country Today.
Ku'watsi Hopa. Thank you for joining us. I'm Malia Chavez. Residents on a Navy base in Hawaii are asking for answers after petroleum product was discovered in their tap water. The Hawaii Department of Health announced Wednesday that a laboratory test result detected what they are calling petroleum product in tap water on the Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. Starting Monday, hundreds of residents living in Navy housing reported smelling chemical odors from their tap water and have since suffered from stomach pains and headaches. Test results by the state did not immediately reveal what kind of petroleum was in the water. U.S. Representative Kai Kahele from Hawaii says he wants to know what happened. On Thursday, he addressed a House Armed Services Committee hearing. He said the base with the contaminated water is near a fuel storage facility called Red Hill.
I'm bringing up Red Hill today because the Navy is currently experiencing a crisis of astronomical proportions in Hawaii. The Navy's water system is contaminated with petroleum. Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam's water systems are entirely shut down. Almost 100,000 people are without water. Our military families, people are getting sick, animals are getting sick, and our military families need answers, and the island of Oahu needs answers.
Other members of Hawaii's congressional delegation are pushing for top Navy officials to address the problem immediately. Washington State's Department of Health is thinking outside of the box to engage the issues some Native communities are facing. The state's health department consulted with tribes and Native organizations to develop and provide mental health resources to Native communities. Some of those resources went to two different advertising campaigns, highlighting both the opioid and suicide crisis in Native communities. Videos were created by Spokane citizen Ryan Abrahamson to show Natives from all walks of life. Abrahamson says it was very important to him to show the people behind the statistics.
Behind the statistic is a human being, and it's very hard to see that sometimes because the statistics are so grotesque. But if anything, that should not treat that. I would love for these videos for the average non-viewer to see is to not treat other Indians like a zoo animal.
The health department says they are working on retrofitting the mental health resources and ads to fit the needs of each tribe. In Mexico, victims of sexual violence are seeking justice with help from Indigenous activists. The women's shelter, House of Knowledge, was introduced at the end of September. It is part of the state's reparations to women who are victims of violence. Inez Fernandez is an Indigenous activist who helped build this shelter, and she understands firsthand the need for such support.
The
House of Knowledge Center is for us women to have the courage to raise our voices and to ask for support for us women.
At the end of March in 2002, Fernandez said she was sexually abused by a Mexican Army personnel at the age of 25. She filed her complaint with police, but Fernandez said she was discriminated against and not believed because she was an Indigenous woman. Years later, the court issued a judgment which found the Mexican state guilty of committing military institutional violence against her. It ordered a significant sentence against the Mexican state. Well, get your snacks ready because the Indigenous Bowl is back. More than 60 Native prep athletes are in Minneapolis this week to compete at the home of the NFL's Minnesota Vikings. The inaugural game was played in 2017, and this year will be the fourth time it has taken place. The game will be free and open to the public. It will also be live streamed on the Indigenous Bowl Facebook page. ICT reporter and producer Colby Kickingwoman will cover this exciting showcase of Indigenous talent, and we'll have more next week. And those are the headlines for Indian Country today. I'm Aaliyah Chavez. Up next, ICT takes you to Chaco Canyon and Alcatraz Island, and we hear stories of identity from Native youth. Stay with us.
This is Indian Country Today.
Interior Secretary Deb Haaland traveled to the sacred site Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico last week. She was joined by tribal, state, and federal leaders to celebrate the announcement that President Joe Biden will block new federal oil and gas leasing within a 10-mile radius of Chaco over the next 20 years. This move is something that many tribal leaders had been working on to protect this place. One of those leaders is Acoma Pueblo Governor Brian Bayo. Governor Bayo is the chairman of the Chaco Heritage Tribal Association, and he tells us about this special place.
One of the things that I always do when I travel to Chaco is that there's a particular place that I stop before entering the park, and just reflecting on the process of pilgrimage and asking permission to enter the space, and upon doing that, make my way into the area, and it's so you just feel the energy once you make that entrance, and you look around and you don't really notice much. The architectural remnants of the place are sometimes you have to really concentrate to see them, but they mesh into the landscape, and so the trek there is a process, and one of the things that I appreciate is the great care that has been taken to manage this area, and not only the architectural remnants, but the resource of the land and everything around that place is well managed. And so, once you get there, once you arrive, it's always such a great experience just to take in the energy and to touch the rock and to feel the earth. It's quite powerful.
President Biden made this announcement at the Tribal Nations Summit.
That was significant to hear directly from the President of the United States, of his intent, and one of his priorities being to protect the greater Chaco landscape. That was huge. Coming together at Chaco with Secretary Haaland and Congressional Representative Stansbury, Ledger Fernandez, and other officials, both federal and state officials, and of course tribal leadership, was significant to celebrate and commemorate this action and this initiative of President Biden and his administration to finally work towards the protections that the greater Chaco landscape does require, so that it continues to remain as not only a national and world heritage site, but that it is maintained and protected for the people, the Pueblo people, the Hopi people, the Navajo people.
Governor Bayo talked about protection of sacred sites in a broader context.
It has created advocacy groups comprised of Native American people themselves. It's setting I think a new tone that is really needed in this time as we think about the protection of our resources, the environment, the land that we live on, our water, our air, and people. And so I think, there's a strong human factor here. And when we think about sacred sites, everything is sacred, right? I mean, our environment is sacred. Um, and so when we begin this dialogue, and when we are thinking about climate change and we're thinking about, our futures, this I believe presents an opportunity for us to have that discourse that is more focused, that is considers the needs of all people, Native and Indigenous peoples in this country. And I'm really grateful that we've reached this point and that we can begin um, the next phase as this work will be ongoing.
That was Acoma Pueblo Governor Brian Vayo. On Thanksgiving Day, Indigenous people gathered in prayer and solidarity. The 43rd annual Sunrise Gathering was held on Alcatraz Island near San Francisco. Participants say it proves that 400 years later, Native people have not vanished. ICT's Deputy Managing Editor, Dalton Walker, reports.
In the early morning, Indigenous people walked off the ferry and onto Alcatraz Island. They gathered on the lands of the Yelamu and Ohlone people for a day of solidarity. This gathering has been the norm for the Bay Area Native community for decades. It is held on the federal holiday known as Thanksgiving. While millions of people in the U.S. commemorate the day with a baked bird and the fixings, Native people gather on the rock for prayer, dancing, singing, and community. One of the featured guests this year was Lakota citizen Arvo Looking Horse. He is the 19th keeper of the sacred white buffalo calf pipe and bundle. Organizer Morningstar Galley says it was beautiful to welcome people from all over Turtle Island.
We continue on those prayers that were made over 40 years ago here on this island, those prayers that were made over 50 years ago during the occupation of Alcatraz by Indians of all tribes. We are here today to honor all of our warriors. We are here today in solidarity, in resistance, for our continued healing of our communities. So we come together to offer that prayer with over 5,000 people in attendance. But it was a really beautiful gathering, and we look forward to being able to host again next year.
This year, the participants discussed issues such as mercury contamination, oil pipelines, and the Indian boarding school era. Thursday's Sunrise Gathering also commemorated the historic occupation of Alcatraz in 1969. 1 week earlier, Interior Secretary Deb Haaland visited the island. She acknowledged a time when Native people took over Alcatraz and occupied the former federal prison for 19 months. One Sunrise participant says that having a ceremony on this day may help undo some of the lies associated with the holiday.
People want to think about us that we're just in history books, that we are no longer here. So by being here, different nations, different tribes, we are showing presence. What you just saw, Danza Azteca, is a pre-colonial prayer movement. That was practiced by indigenous people of the Anahuac, which is what we wrongfully call Mexico. There's many tribes, here before colonization. So we just here saying that after 535 years, we are still here as indigenous people.
On Alcatraz Island, Dalton Walker, Indian Country Today.
Geronimo Louie has amassed more than 162,000 followers on the social media platform TikTok. He is a Chiricahua Apache and Dene content creator. Posting videos of his Two-Spirit and Indigenous identity, Geronimo is now using his platform as a way to uplift Indigenous voices. He is also a fashion designer and a youth director for Dene Pride, something he also posts about. Let's take a look.
May, June, July, August, September. This one is my favorite.
One of the platforms Geronimo Louis speaks on is inclusion for two-spirit individuals. Major retailer Target recently partnered with him for National Coming Out Day.
Target had reached out to me and asked me to promote some of their LGBTQ stories, books, and authors that they were celebrating in terms of what is it called? Spirit Day and National Coming Out Day. And so I was like, yeah, I was on board. As a youth pride director, it was something that was in line with me. And they're like, yeah, we have some POCs, authors, characters, and stories like that. And that's where it was for me. And one of my favorite books that I got to promote was called Hunani Hula Warrior. And I was so happy they had that story because it's a story about another Indigenous Hawaiian girl who also sees herself as a two-spirit individual, and she finds her way throughout her teachings of hula dancing and stuff like that. And it was just amazing. And it's important to take on those kinds of roles, especially in today's world, because we need better representation of Indigenous peoples, and whether that be off camera, on camera, for commercials, movies, red carpets, I'm here for it.
That was Geronimo Louis, two-spirit TikTok creative. When we come back, more stories of identity.
This is Indian Country Today.
This month, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act turns 50. Known as ANCSA, this law set up a different type of enrollment for Alaska Natives. We have a partnership with Alaska Public Media to cover this complex story. Our special correspondent, Megan Sullivan, looks at identity among Alaska Native youth.
Alyssa London has always felt most at home with her Tlingit community.
I am a proud Tlingit woman who grew up with her family telling her who she is and where she comes from.
London knows her culture's past and lives out the values and traditions daily. It's the future she has questions about.
So I would like future generations to not have to defend their identity as much and to just be able to be raised with that sense of who they are and to just be able to continue to walk in the footsteps of their parents and grandparents and uphold that legacy.
This is a historic moment for the Native of Alaska.
When the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act passed into law, it established 12 corporations. Those who are at least 1/4 Alaska Native and born before December 18, 1971, were eligible to receive 100 shares in their corporation. So now, corporations are faced with a big decision. Open up enrollment to descendants born after the initial date, or stick with original shareholders only.
Anytime you have a policy that says you get this and you don't, it creates divide.
Corporations will also have to decide whether to allow descendants who are less than 1/4 Alaska Native to enroll.
If we continue to use blood quantum as a measure of how Native we are, there is a time in the future where there will no longer be Native people.
Ayu Kasatak, who's a Nupiaq, was born after the ANCSA deadline, meaning she couldn't enroll in her regional or village corporation. But last summer, her mom gave her a small number of shares. That means she can further contribute to her home region through her voting rights as a shareholder.
It really lit a fire within me to ensure that these corporations and organizations that represent Alaska Native people are inclusive of our Native people.
Alaska Native shareholders can't sell their shares, but they can pass them on in their wills or gift them to others. Some argue that the setup is fair because it doesn't dilute the worth of the shares. Others believe it is unreliable. Descendants might not get any shares or have enough to pass down to their children. Now a mom herself, Ayu is thinking ahead to how enrollment policies might impact future generations of Alaska Natives.
The much bigger picture is, what are we setting up for the future of these corporations if we are not including our people? 100 years from now, when the original shareholders of ANCSA are no longer with us, who will be the decision makers in our corporations? Who will have the votes?
6 out of 12 regional corporations have opened up enrollment to descendants of the original shareholders. In 2015, Chilista shareholders voted to open enrollment to descendants and remove blood quantum requirements. Their shareholder base has since grown from 13,000 to over 34,000.
We're very much about sharing in our community, helping others. Part of that was Chilista shareholders feeling that they wanted to share in the ability to enroll as a shareholder.
Chilista's communication director, Tom Leonard, was born 2 months before the ANCSA deadline, meaning he could enroll while his younger siblings couldn't. Once separated by an arbitrary date, his whole family is now able to be a part of the corporation.
Being able to provide and support those opportunities for the next generation is important.
Alex Lacey is one of those new shareholders. Lacey is part of Hooper-based tribe where her family is from. She lives in Anchorage and was able to enroll in Chilista as a descendant around a year ago.
So this is a picture of me and my grandma, and I'm considered the descendant of her, so she's the reason why I'm enrolled in Chilista.
While Lacey feels closer to her tribe, she values the educational and professional opportunities that her corporation provides.
They do, finance my school. I do get dividends. There's a lot of opportunities that are available to me from being a descendant from that region that I'm grateful for.
Shareholders will ultimately determine what happens to the corporations and the traditional lands they oversee.
In order for the lands to be in good hands in the future, in order for the corporations to be run well, that there needs to be more involvement of younger generations, either in board settings or in leadership development roles.
London's excited to help shape what the next 50 years of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act will look like, alongside the new perspectives and dynamic thinking of other young Alaska Native shareholders. For Indian Country Today and Alaska Public Media, I'm Megan Sullivan.
Jim Thorpe inspired generations of natives. Now, Ojibwe and Oneida hip-hop artist Tall Paul is honoring Thorpe through music. Let's watch.
I was born and raised in South Minneapolis. When I was about 14 years old is when I picked up the pen and pad and started writing raps. It was just something for me to do to keep me feeling like I had a purpose in life, Growing up, I didn't have any positive role models who were pushing me to do excellent things with my life. My dad wasn't around. He had been in prison. My mom had her own struggles, abusive relationships, and things like that. The history books, the movies, they all reinforced this stereotype that we're alcoholics or somehow less competent. And as a kid, I subconsciously believed that or wondered, But all that changed when I discovered who Jim Thorpe was. He broke those falsehoods.
No man has ever touched the record of Jim Thorpe as an all-round athlete. He played pro football until he was 40.
He was always the best at anything he did. That's what Jim Thorpe symbolized for me, Indigenous excellence. Growing up, I was a sports fanatic. I played big games of football, out in the fields, in the streets. I'd always see and hear about these superstar athletes, but none that were indigenous.
It's indigenous excellence when we touch down.
So I started wondering about that until I came across Jim Thorpe. Started doing research on him, reading books on him, and man, he was indigenous, he was raised indigenous, and he was just smashing the competition. So that's really where this whole idea to write an album about Jim Thorpe is rooted. He was someone for me to look up to see that I could compete with anybody, regardless of race or ethnicity.
Hi. Yep. You can do your 4-point stance if you want, remember. You're just like this. You still want one foot back, further back than the other one, whatever's comfortable with you. And then just know this is more of a pass rush stance, or else like a goal line run stop, you know, where you got to get through the goal line real fast. Huh. Stab. Yep. Yeah, like, do it again. You see that arm come up? Like that. And your arm is kind of coming just like by your ear, like a swim, like you're swimming. I want to be able to move laterally quick with a quick guy like you at defensive end or linebacker. Tight. Yep. It's hard for them to block that.
I just hope this album inspires people, you know, especially Native youth who grow up without positive role models, father figures. When you come from a people that represent roughly 1% of the US population, you don't really see yourself on the TV screen or hear yourself on the radio. So this is about representation for our people.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. For more news and updates, visit IndianCountryToday.com. Stay safe, my relatives, and have a great weekend. I'm Aaliyah Chavez.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run.
This is Indian Country Today.